Imagine waking up one day and realizing there's no one you could text if something went wrong. Not because you're dramatic, not because you want attention, but because, if you're being honest with yourself, there's no name that feels right to type. No one who would really understand. No one who would stay on the line long enough to hear the whole truth. The room is quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the kind that presses inward. The kind that makes you suddenly aware of how loud your own thoughts have become. You tell yourself you're fine. You always do. You go to work. You scroll. You laugh at the right moments. You function. On the surface, nothing looks broken. And yet, beneath that normality, there's a strange contradiction forming. You are more connected than any generation before you, yet somehow more alone. How does that happen? At what point does being independent quietly turn into being isolated? At what point does I don't need anyone become I don't have anyone? And why does the absence of friends feel less like a sudden loss and more like something that slowly faded without anyone noticing? Here's the unsettling part. Most people who have no friends don't feel abnormal. They feel rational, self-sufficient, even morally justified. They tell themselves stories that make sense. I'm just busy. People are exhausting. I prefer my own company. I've outgrown shallow relationships. And sometimes those stories are true, but sometimes they're armor, because there's a difference between choosing solitude and ending up alone. And that difference is almost never obvious while it's happening. Loneliness, contrary to popular belief, doesn't always arrive with pain. It often arrives with numbness, with efficiency, with a quiet narrowing of life until it becomes manageable, predictable, and emotionally safe. Safe but small. This is why the psychology of people with no friends is not what you think. It's easy to assume that people without friends are socially awkward, unlikable, or broken in some obvious way, that they failed at something everyone else figured out. But that assumption misses something deeper and far more uncomfortable. What if losing all your friends isn't a failure of character, but a byproduct of adaptation? What if the mind, when exposed to enough disappointment, misunderstanding, rejection, or emotional overload, doesn't collapse, but adjusts? Not by screaming, not by falling apart, but by slowly turning the volume down on connection itself. Think about it. How many times can you feel unseen before you stop trying to be seen? How many small rejections does it take before your brain decides that closeness simply isn't worth the risk? The human mind is efficient. Brutally so. It doesn't ask whether something is meaningful. It asks whether it is costly. And relationships are costly. They demand emotional exposure. They require misunderstanding, repair, compromise. They force you to sit with discomfort instead of escaping it. So what happens when a mind decides the cost is too high? It doesn't announce its decision. It just starts letting go. You reply slower. You cancel more often. You stop initiating. You tell yourself you're tired, busy, focused. And eventually, the invitations stop coming. Not because people hate you. Not because you're unworthy. But because absence, repeated enough times, becomes a signal. This is the paradox no one talks about. The same psychological traits that make someone introspective, self-aware, independent, and emotionally controlled can also make them quietly drift into isolation. And once you're there, something strange happens. You don't feel lonely all the time. Sometimes you feel relieved. Relieved that no one expects anything from you. Relieved that no one can disappoint you. Relieved that you don't have to perform closeness when you don't feel it. Which raises a disturbing question. If being alone feels easier, why does it also feel like something essential is missing? Why does life feel flatter, quieter, less dimensional, like a world rendered in fewer colors? And why, despite all your rational explanations, does a small voice inside you still whisper that this wasn't how things were supposed to be? That voice is not weakness. It's not nostalgia. It's a signal. Because the absence of friends is rarely about social skill. It's about something much deeper, something rooted in psychology, identity, and the way modern life reshapes the human mind without asking permission. And once you see what's actually happening beneath the surface, you can't unsee it. The real problem doesn't begin when you have no friends. It begins much earlier, when your mind learns quietly and efficiently how to protect itself. Psychology often frames human behavior as a pursuit of pleasure and avoidance of pain. But that explanation is too shallow to capture what's happening here. People don't drift into friendlessness because they dislike connection. They drift because connection becomes psychologically expensive. Carl Jung once suggested that the psyche does not eliminate what hurts, it buries it. And buried things do not disappear. They reorganize behavior from the shadows. Every misunderstood conversation, every time you felt emotionally exposed and unsupported, every moment where closeness demanded more than it gave. None of these experiences need to be catastrophic. In fact, the most powerful ones are subtle. Small disappointments accumulate like invisible weight. And eventually, the mind adapts, not by confronting the pain, but by restructuring desire itself. You stop wanting what once hurt you. This is the hidden mechanism. From the outside, it looks like preference. I like being alone. I'm more productive this way. I don't enjoy small talk. From inside, it's something else entirely. A recalibration of emotional risk. The brain, especially the adult brain, is less concerned with fulfillment than with stability. It learns patterns quickly. If repeated attempts at closeness result in confusion, rejection, obligation, or exhaustion, the nervous system draws a conclusion long before conscious thought gets involved. Connection equals volatility. Distance equals control. So distance becomes attractive. Friedrich Nietzsche warned about this kind of retreat. He noticed how intelligent, sensitive individuals often withdraw not out of arrogance, but out of overexposure. When the world feels too loud, too shallow, or too demanding, solitude becomes a refuge. But Nietzsche also cautioned that refuge can harden into exile. What begins as self-protection slowly becomes self-erasure. Modern psychology has a name for part of this process: avoidant attachment. But labels don't capture the lived experience. Because avoidant individuals don't feel afraid of relationships. They feel unmoved by them. Or worse, burdened. They value independence, logic, self-regulation. They pride themselves on not needing reassurance, not leaning too hard on others, not being needy. And society rewards this. You are praised for being self-sufficient, admired for being focused, respected for not relying on anyone. But no one tells you the cost. Jean-Paul Sartre believed that human identity is forged in relation to others, that we come to understand ourselves through being seen. Remove that mirror, and the self begins to thin out. You still exist, but without reflection, your sense of meaning becomes abstract. You start asking questions like, what's the point of sharing this? Who would care? Why explain myself at all? These aren't signs of arrogance. They're signs of a shrinking relational world. Arthur Schopenhauer, famously pessimistic, argued that relationships inevitably involve suffering. To him, solitude was the lesser evil. And on the surface, he wasn't wrong. Being alone reduces friction. It eliminates conflict. It simplifies life. But Schopenhauer overlooked something crucial. Meaning doesn't arise from comfort. It arises from tension. Viktor Frankl, who survived the absolute isolation of concentration camps, observed that humans can endure almost anything except meaninglessness. And meaning, he argued, is relational. It comes from responsibility to a person, a cause, a shared reality. When friendships disappear, meaning doesn't collapse immediately. It fades. Days become efficient but forgettable. Thoughts deepen but circle inward. Life becomes manageable but strangely weightless. This is why people with no friends often feel mentally sharp but emotionally flat. The mind becomes active. The heart goes quiet. There's also a cultural layer to this problem. Modern life fragments community. Work replaces belonging. Screens simulate interaction without requiring vulnerability. You can consume voices, opinions, and personalities endlessly without ever being known. Aldous Huxley predicted this, not through oppression, but through distraction. A world where loneliness wouldn't feel like deprivation, because it would be padded with stimulation. And so, instead of asking, why don't I have friends? the mind asks safer questions. Why bother? Isn't this easier? Don't people just complicate things? These questions feel rational, even enlightened, but they hide a deeper truth. The psyche has learned to trade depth for safety. And the most dangerous part? You don't feel the loss until something breaks the illusion. A moment of unexpected silence. A crisis with no one to call. A success with no one to share it with. Suddenly, the efficiency of solitude feels hollow. And yet, by this point, re-entering connection feels foreign. Risky. Almost unnatural. This is the psychological trap. You didn't choose to have no friends. You adapted into it. And adaptation, once complete, feels like identity. But adaptation is not destiny. And the consequences of mistaking the two are far deeper than most people realize. The most dangerous consequences of having no friends are not dramatic. They don't announce themselves as pain. They don't arrive as breakdowns. They don't even feel like loneliness, at least not at first. They arrive as subtle distortions in how you experience reality. When human connection disappears, the mind doesn't panic. It compensates. And compensation, when left unchecked, reshapes perception itself. One of the first changes happens in how you interpret other people. Without regular, meaningful social feedback, your internal narrative grows louder and less challenged. There's no one to casually contradict your assumptions. No one to soften your conclusions. No one to mirror you back to yourself in real time. So the mind fills in the gaps. Neutral interactions start to feel dismissive. Ambiguity feels like rejection. Silence feels intentional. Psychology calls this negativity bias, the brain's tendency to overweight potential threats. Normally, relationships act as a corrective force. A friend's presence reminds you that not every distance is personal. Not every misunderstanding is abandonment. Without that correction, your inner world becomes more absolute. You don't just feel separate from people. You begin to feel fundamentally different from them. And once that belief sets in, it quietly reinforces itself. Cognitive neuroscience shows that the brain is plastic. It rewires based on repeated experience. Social interaction stimulates regions responsible for empathy, emotional regulation, and perspective taking. When those circuits are underused, they don't vanish, but they dull. This doesn't make you less human. It makes you less socially fluent. Conversations start to feel effortful. Small talk feels pointless. Emotional exchanges feel confusing or draining. So you withdraw further. Not because you hate people, but because your nervous system has forgotten how to rest in connection. There's also a physiological layer to this. Loneliness, chronic, not occasional, activates the same stress pathways as physical threat. Cortisol rises. Hypervigilance increases. The body stays slightly braced, as if something is always about to go wrong. But because there's no obvious danger, the tension turns inward. Sleep becomes lighter. Thoughts loop more often. Your mind rehearses conversations that never happen. You become sharper, more analytical, more inwardly complex, but also more isolated inside your own head. This is where many people mistake the consequences for personality. I'm just introverted. I'm just private. I'm just built differently. Sometimes that's true, but sometimes it's adaptation masquerading as identity. Culture reinforces this confusion. Independence is celebrated. Emotional distance is framed as maturity. Needing others is subtly shamed. So when connection fades, it feels like progress. Until it doesn't. Because meaning doesn't scale down gracefully. As friendships disappear, experiences lose contrast. Joy becomes muted. Suffering becomes quieter but heavier. Life continues, but without resonance. You might notice it during moments that should feel full. A personal achievement that feels oddly empty. A beautiful thought with nowhere to land. A realization that there's no shared history being built anymore. Only time passing. Sociologists call this social thinning, a reduction in the density of relational meaning. Life becomes efficient but less layered. You're not suffering intensely, but you're not alive intensely either. And this is where the most dangerous illusion forms. You start believing that this flatness is simply adulthood. That depth was a phase. That closeness was youthful. That this muted existence is just how things are now. But something inside you resists that conclusion. Because humans evolve in tribes, not timelines. We are not built to witness life alone. Identity itself forms through shared memory, through someone remembering who you were when you forgot. Without that, the self becomes unstable in a quiet way. You may feel like you're always starting over, like nothing quite sticks, like your inner world is rich but sealed off. This isolation also reshapes morality and empathy. Not in extreme ways, but subtly. Without close bonds, it becomes harder to feel emotionally invested in others' inner lives. Not out of cruelty, but out of distance. Other people become abstractions, characters, noise. And the more abstract people become, the easier it is to disengage entirely. This is the final tightening of the trap. You didn't lose friends because you don't care. You stopped caring because you lost friends. The direction matters. Because once the psyche accepts isolation as the default, the idea of returning to connection feels unnatural, exposing, almost unsafe. You tell yourself you're fine, and in many ways you are. But beneath that stability is a quiet truth. Something essential has been going unused for too long. And unused things don't stay neutral. They either wither or demand to be reclaimed. And that demand, when it finally surfaces, is what creates the turning point. The moment where comfort is no longer enough. The way out does not begin with meeting new people. That's the first illusion that has to collapse. Most people assume the solution to having no friends is social expansion. More effort, more exposure, more activity. Join something. Message someone. Put yourself out there. But if the internal structure hasn't changed, all of that becomes performance. Forced. Unsustainable. Real rebellion begins much earlier. It begins the moment you stop asking, "How do I get friends?" and start asking, "What did my mind learn that made connection feel unnecessary?" Because isolation is not the enemy. Avoidance is. The psyche didn't withdraw randomly. It withdrew intelligently. It learned that distance reduced emotional cost, that silence meant control, that not needing anyone meant not being disappointed. So the first step is not self-criticism, but recognition. You don't punish an adaptation. You outgrow it. This is where the rebellion becomes radical. Instead of forcing yourself into social situations, you begin by dismantling the beliefs that made solitude feel safer than connection. One of the most powerful is this: needing people makes me weak. This belief hides everywhere. In productivity culture, in self-help, in modern definitions of strength. But history tells a different story. Nietzsche, often misread as a prophet of isolation, actually warned against emotional starvation. His concept of the Übermensch was not a solitary figure cut off from others, but one capable of creating meaning through deep engagement with life, including others. Strength was never about detachment. It was about capacity. The capacity to endure misunderstanding. The capacity to repair rupture. The capacity to stay present when connection feels uncomfortable. Most people don't avoid friendships because they dislike people. They avoid them because they dislike the version of themselves that appears in closeness. Uncertain, exposed, emotionally visible. So the rebellion begins inward. You start by allowing small, controlled fractures in your self-sufficiency. Not dramatic confessions. Not forced vulnerability, but tiny acts of reentry. Sharing a thought without perfect wording. Staying present in a conversation instead of retreating mentally. Letting someone see a rough edge without smoothing it over. These moments feel inefficient. That's how you know they're working. Viktor Frankl believed that meaning arises when we choose responsibility over comfort. Not obligation, but responsibility. The willingness to show up despite discomfort because something matters more than safety. Friendship, at its core, is not about enjoyment. It's about witnessing. Letting someone witness your becoming. And agreeing to witness theirs. This reframes the entire process. You stop asking, Do I enjoy this person? And start asking, can I remain present here? Presence is the muscle that isolation weakens. And like any atrophied muscle, it must be rebuilt slowly. There's also a crucial shift in how you interpret friction. Most isolated minds treat discomfort in relationships as evidence that something is wrong, that the connection isn't natural, that compatibility is lacking. But discomfort is not a signal to withdraw. It's a signal that something real is happening. Jean-Paul Sartre argued that other people force us to confront parts of ourselves we would rather ignore. That's why connection feels invasive. It interrupts self-control. But interruption is not harm. It's contact. The rebellion, then, is choosing contact over control. Again and again. This also means letting go of the fantasy of the perfect friend. The one who understands effortlessly, who never drains you, who fits seamlessly into your inner world. That fantasy is another defense. Real connection is asymmetrical, messy, occasionally disappointing, but it's also grounding. It anchors you to time, to memory, to shared reality. One of the most counterintuitive truths is this. You don't rebuild connection by seeking people who need nothing from you. You rebuild it by allowing yourself to matter to someone, even in small ways. Matter enough to be missed. Matter enough to be relied upon. Matter enough to occasionally fail. This is terrifying to an isolated psyche, because mattering creates consequence. And consequence is what avoidance was designed to eliminate. But consequence is also what gives life weight. Without it, everything floats. The rebellion is not loud. It doesn't announce itself. It happens quietly, in moments where you choose engagement over retreat, imperfection over control, presence over safety. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the nervous system relearns something it forgot. That connection does not always cost more than it gives. That discomfort does not equal danger. That being seen does not automatically mean being diminished. And once that realization begins to stabilize, something unexpected happens. Solitude stops feeling like a shield and starts feeling like a choice again, which is the only form of solitude that is actually free. At some point, usually in silence, a realization surfaces that changes everything. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with a strange calm that feels heavier than panic. You realize that the problem was never that you had no friends. The problem was that you stopped allowing yourself to be formed by others. Because here is the truth most people never articulate. Friends do not exist to keep you company. They exist to shape you. Human beings are not finished objects. We are processes, and processes require friction, resistance, reflection. Without others, the self begins to close in on itself. You still think. You still grow in one direction. But without relational gravity, growth becomes distorted. Like a tree growing without wind, tall but brittle. This is why solitude feels clean but hollow. Why isolation sharpens the mind but dulls the soul. Why being alone too long doesn't hurt. It thins you. You don't notice the loss immediately because nothing collapses. Life continues, but slowly the world loses depth. Memories don't root as deeply. Moments don't echo as long. Experiences don't crystallize into meaning. And then comes the final illusion. You begin to believe that you are complete on your own, that you are self-sufficient, contained, resolved. But completeness is not the same as wholeness. Completeness is static. Wholeness is relational. Carl Jung believed that individuation, the process of becoming yourself, does not happen in isolation. It happens in tension with others. Through conflict, love, disappointment, loyalty, rupture, and repair. You don't discover who you are alone. You become who you are in relation. And this reframes everything. The pain of having no friends was never about social failure. It was about stalled becoming. You weren't lonely. You were unfinished. This is why even the most intelligent, disciplined, introspective people eventually feel something missing when they walk alone too long. Not because they need validation, but because identity needs resistance to take shape. A friend remembers who you were before you forgot. Challenges who you are becoming when you drift. anchors you to reality when your inner world grows too absolute. Without that, the self becomes unchallenged and therefore unreal. This is the final paradox. You don't lose yourself by being shaped by others. You lose yourself by avoiding being shaped at all. Modern culture tells you that autonomy is freedom, that needing others is weakness, that emotional distance is maturity. But every deep philosophical tradition contradicts this. Freedom without connection is emptiness. Strength without vulnerability is rigidity. Independence without belonging is isolation disguised as control. The ultimate truth is not that you need more people. It's that you need impact, to matter and be mattered to affect and be affected, to exist not just as an observer of life, but as a participant in it. Friendship is not a lifestyle accessory. It is an existential necessity, not because you can't survive without it, but because you can't become without it. And here's the quiet hope hidden beneath everything. If isolation was learned, it could be unlearned. If withdrawal was an adaptation, it can be released. You are not broken. You are not deficient. You are not incapable of connection. You simply learned how to live without it. And learning can always be revised. The path forward is not about chasing people. It's about reopening yourself to being shaped again, letting life interrupt you, letting others leave fingerprints on your inner world, letting meaning arise through shared existence rather than private control. This does not mean abandoning solitude. It means restoring balance. Solitude is choice, not refuge. Independence is strength, not armor. Connection is risk, not threat. And when that balance returns, something subtle but profound happens. Life regains weight. Moments linge. Thoughts land. Existence thickens with meaning. Not because you're surrounded by people, but because you're no longer hiding from being human.